Find who wrote this anonymous letter, and I'll adopt you. Charles Whitmore spoke. Annie Bell lifted her head from her laptop, her fingers still resting on the keyboard. The kitchen was completely silent. It was past 2 in the morning. The only light in the room came from the small brass lamp on the breakfast table and the pale blue glow spilling from Annie's laptop screen. The first thing she noticed was his robe, then his bare feet on the cold tile floor, then the glass of water trembling slightly in his hand. "Sir, what letter?" Annie asked softly. "And why are you still awake at this hour?" Charles set the glass down on the table. He reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out 3 cream-colored envelopes. "These anonymous letters," he said, placing them between Annie's laptop and her open notebook. "For 3 nights in a row, they've been slipped through my bedroom window, each time, right before I was about to go to bed." Annie stared at the 3 envelopes. "Through your bedroom window?" "Yes." 3 nights in a row?" Charles nodded. "Same time frame. Same type of envelope. Same method of delivery." Annie lowered the laptop halfway, not shutting it completely, just enough so the light would no longer shine directly into her eyes. She had been working on her online accounting assignment, one of the free college prep courses she had signed herself up for, because college tuition was still such a heavy burden that she had no idea how she would ever manage it. "Have you called security?" she asked. "No." Charles pushed the envelopes closer to her. Annie looked at them, then back at him. "May I look at them?" He gave a short nod. She reached for the first envelope, then stopped. "Am I allowed?" "Yes," Charles said. "Go ahead." Annie picked up the envelope by its edges. The paper was thick and expensive. No stamp. No return address. No name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. She opened it and read, "You think money makes you untouchable? It doesn't. The money laundering will be exposed." Annie's eyes moved to the second letter. "The IRS will love what I'm sending them. So will the board." Then the third envelope. 3 nights now, Mr. Whitmore. How many more nights before your heart stops?" Annie slowly lowered the paper. For a moment, she no longer noticed the piece of cornbread sitting on a napkin, the cup of chamomile tea growing cold beside her laptop, or the sleeves of her old sweater pulled low over her wrists. All she saw was Charles Whitmore standing across from her, quietly waiting as she read the words written for the sole purpose of frightening him. "These are threats," she said. "Yes, but not just threats." Annie looked back at the third letter. "This one is personal." Charles's jaw tightened. "That is why I came down here to find you." Annie leaned back in her chair. "Sir, I'm only 18. I'm not a detective." "No," Charles said. "But you notice things other people miss." Before Annie could answer, a voice came from the hallway. "Dad?" They both turned. Brandon Whitmore stood in the kitchen doorway. He wore dark slacks and an open-collared shirt, 28 years old. One hand rested on the doorframe, the other held his phone. His eyes moved from Charles to Annie, then settled on the letters on the table. "What are you doing down here?" Brandon asked, stepping into the kitchen. "It's 2 in the morning. You should be asleep." Charles straightened slightly. "I came down for water." "At this hour?" Brandon gave a soft laugh, then immediately shifted into a look of concern. "Dad, come on. You've barely slept all week. You can't keep wandering around the house at night like this. It's not good for your heart." Annie took her eyes off the letter. Charles said nothing. Brandon stepped closer and gently placed a hand on the back of his father's chair. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like a tender gesture, but Annie sensed another kind of weight hidden in that hand. "You have meetings tomorrow morning," Brandon continued. "The board is already worried that you're overworking yourself. I told them you were fine, but you need to help me so I can help you." Charles looked at his son. "I did not ask you to speak to the board about my health. I didn't make a big deal out of it." Brandon smiled, but his eyes remained sharp as a blade. "I just don't want people getting the wrong idea." Then his gaze dropped to Annie's hand. She was still holding the third letter. The change in Brandon's face happened almost instantly. His expression hardened, then filled with a surge of anger so intense it looked almost unnatural. "What the hell is this?" he asked. Annie froze. Charles turned toward him. "Brandon." "No, I'm serious." Brandon pointed at the envelope in Annie's hand. "Why is she holding that?" Annie set the letter down. "Mr. Whitmore showed it to me." Brandon let out a bitter, cutting laugh. "He showed it to you? At 2 in the morning? In the kitchen?" Lower your voice, Charles said, but Brandon seemed to have found his role, and he slipped into it far too quickly. Is this what you've been doing? He snapped at Annie. Writing letters to my father? Sneaking them to him while everyone else is asleep? Annie looked straight at him. What are you talking about? You heard me. Brandon snatched one of the envelopes from the table and held it up as if he had just discovered the evidence himself. Every night, you sit here with that little laptop and those little notebooks, pretending to study. Have you been writing love letters to him? Is that it? Annie's face went cold before the pain could show. Charles rose from his chair. That is enough. But Brandon did not stop. No, Dad, look at this. She's 18 years old. Living in your house with her mother without paying a dime in rent. And now she's secretly passing letters to you in the middle of the night. You don't find that strange? They are threatening letters, Charles said. Brandon blinked, as if the word had genuinely surprised him, but he recovered quickly. Threatening? Yes. She threatened you? No. How do you know? Brandon turned sharply toward Annie. Maybe she thought she could scare you. Maybe she thought that if you felt sorry enough for her, you'd give her money. Or a scholarship. Or something more. Annie slowly stood. I did not write those letters, she said. Brandon gave a faint, mocking smile. Of course you'd say that. I asked to see them because your father handed them to me. My father is tired. My father is not thinking clearly. Charles's face tightened. Watch your words. But Brandon kept going, his voice filled with a perfectly performed kind of hurt. I'm the one trying to protect you. I came down here because I heard voices, and I found you sitting with the maid's daughter while she was holding private letters you never even showed your own son. Her name is Annie, Charles said. Brandon looked at him. I know her name. Then use it. For a few seconds, father and son stared at each other across the kitchen table. One was barefoot, sleepless, and older than he ever looked in daylight. The other was neatly dressed, standing tall, as if he had never once been denied entry into any room in his life. Annie looked back and forth between father and son, and inside her, the first seed of suspicion began to rise quietly. Brandon had walked in wearing a carefully performed expression of concern, but the moment he saw the letters, he immediately built a story. He did not ask what had happened. He did not seem afraid. He did not look confused. He simply invented a story. A filthy story. A useful story. A story that made Annie look small and made Charles look like a foolish old man being taken advantage of. Brandon turned to Charles and lowered his voice, as if he were trying to stay calm. Dad, I'm saying this because I love you. You need rest. You need to stay away from stress. And you certainly don't need midnight conversations with a girl who has no business getting involved in our family matters. Charles's eyes never left his son. These letters are not a family matter. Everything that happens under this roof is a family matter. No, Charles said. Some things that happen under this roof are crimes. Brandon froze for half a second. Then he laughed. Softer this time, but colder too. Fine. Then call security. Call the police. Call whoever you want. But don't sit here handing sensitive things to her, as if she's qualified to handle your life. She may be more qualified than you think, Charles said. Brandon's eyes flashed. Because she takes online classes in your kitchen? Because she listens before she opens her mouth? Annie felt her face grow hot. She did not want Charles defending her as if she were a victim who needed protection. But she also could not allow Brandon's accusations to pass, as if they had not hurt her. Before anyone could say another word, a voice came from the doorway. Annie? Lena Bell stood there in a faded robe, her hair wrapped in a scarf, her eyes still heavy with sleep. But that sleepiness vanished the moment she saw Charles, Brandon, her daughter, and the letters spread across the kitchen table. What is going on? Lena asked. Brandon answered before anyone else could. Your daughter is secretly meeting with my father in the kitchen. Lena's eyes moved to Annie, then to Charles, then stopped on the letters. Annie quickly said, That is not what happened. Brandon raised both hands, as if he were the one being insulted. I walked in and found her holding letters. My father standing here in his robe, and everyone acting as if I'm the unreasonable one. Charles's voice filled the room, low and clear. You are speaking in a very ugly way. Brandon's lips pressed together. Lena stepped closer to the table. Annie, Mr. Whitmore received these letters, Annie said. They were slipped through his bedroom window for 3 nights in a row. He asked me to look at them. Lena had read only a few lines before the color of her face changed. No, she said. Charles looked at her. Mrs. Bell. No, sir. Lena's voice remained respectful, but beneath it was a firmness that could not be moved. Whatever this is, my daughter has nothing to do with it. Mom, Annie said softly. Lena did not take her eyes off Charles. We are grateful that you let us stay here. We are grateful for your help, but we are not your security team. We are not your lawyers, and we are not the people who should carry the burdens of your family. Brandon gave a soft laugh. Finally, someone is talking sense. Lena turned to him. I was not speaking to you, Mr. Brandon. The kitchen fell silent at once. Charles looked down at the envelopes on the table. I made Annie an offer before you walked in. Lena's face tightened. What kind of offer? Charles looked at Annie first, then at her mother. I told her that if she could find out who has been slipping these letters through my bedroom window, I would adopt her. Lena went still. Brandon stared at his father. What did you just say? Annie almost forgot to breathe. Charles continued. His voice was calmer now, though his hand still rested near the edge of the table, as if he needed the wood to keep himself standing. Legally, properly, with Mrs. Bell's consent, and without separating Annie from her mother. Brandon's face flushed red. Have you lost your mind? Charles slowly turned toward his son. That question sounds prepared. Brandon opened his mouth, then closed it again. Lena's eyes shone, but her voice did not tremble. My daughter already has a mother. I know, Charles said. Do you really? He looked at Annie's laptop, her notes, her worn old sweater, and the stack of library books beside her chair. I know she has a future that money could make less painful to reach. I know she has a mind this house has ignored every day. And I know someone under my roof is trying to destroy me slowly. Slowly enough for it to look like age, stress, or weakness. Lena folded her arms across her chest. And you want my daughter to carry that? No, Charles said. I want her to see the things other people may be paid not to see, trained to overlook, or too afraid to speak about. Annie looked down at the third letter again. Sir, she said, if I help you, it won't be because I want a new father. Lena closed her eyes. Charles waited in silence. And it won't be because of your Whitmore name, Annie added. Then why? Charles asked. Annie lifted her head. Because someone is turning fear into a weapon. And people like that always count on the silent ones staying silent. Brandon scoffed. That sounds like something from one of those cheap online classes. Annie looked straight at him. No, she said. It's something I learned from people like you. For the first time that night, Brandon had no quick answer. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share in the comments where you are watching from. And if you believe kindness and justice still matter, subscribe to the channel and join us for more powerful stories. Outside the kitchen windows, the garden lights stood steady along the stone path. No rain, no storm, no sound from the sky. Just a silent house, a locked gate, and somewhere inside it, a person who knew exactly where Charles Whitmore slept. Annie picked up her pencil and opened her laptop again. What time did the first letter arrive? Charles exhaled slowly. 11:47. Annie wrote it down. Brandon watched her hand move across the page, and in the corner of his mouth, something almost like anger twitched. Under the kitchen lamp, before Dawn had even considered touching the windows, the investigation began. Brandon left first, but not cleanly. He backed away from the table as if the letters had made the kitchen less safe, then gave his father one last careful look. You'll regret this in the morning, he said. Charles did not answer. That girl can't fix what's wrong with you. Lena stepped forward before Charles could. Mr. Brandon, you have said enough for one night. He looked at her as though he had forgotten she could speak without permission. Careful, Mrs. Bell. Lena's chin rose. I have been careful all my life. That is why my daughter is standing here with more manners than most people born upstairs. Annie felt a sharp ache behind her ribs. She wanted to tell her mother to stop. Not because Lena was wrong, but because the wrong people in large houses always had more ways to punish the truth. Brandon smiled at that, but it did not reach his eyes. Enjoy the little mystery, he said. Just don't confuse being useful with belonging. He walked out, his footsteps fading down the hall toward the main staircase. Nobody moved until the sound disappeared. Charles reached for the glass of water and drank half of it. His hand was steadier now, though his face had lost color. Lena noticed. So did Annie. You should sit down, sir, Annie said. I am sitting. No, she said gently. You're holding yourself up. That made Charles look at her. Not offended. Not amused. Caught. Slowly, he lowered himself fully into the chair. For the first time since Annie had known him, he looked less like the owner of the house than a man trapped inside it. Lena gathered the letters and pushed them back toward Charles. This stops tonight. Call your security chief. Call your attorney. Call the police if you have to. I will, Charles said. Then why involve Annie? Because the police will look for an intruder, Annie said before she could stop herself. But whoever did this knew when he went to bed, where the window was, and how to scare him without waking the house. Lena turned to her. Annie, I'm not trying to argue. Yes, you are, politely. Charles almost smiled, but the moment passed. Annie looked at the letters again. The first two mentioned money crimes. Laundering. Taxes. The board. Those are public fears for a man like Mr. Whitmore. But the third letter mentions his heart. That means whoever wrote it knows something private, or at least knows what rumor to use. Lena's expression tightened. And that is exactly why you should not be near it. Annie closed her laptop. Mom, we're already near it. We live here. That quiet truth settled in the room. The East Wing was not theirs, not really. Their beds, their clothes, Lena's old quilt, Annie's scholarship papers, the little radio they played on Sunday mornings while Lena made eggs and grits, all of it existed under Charles Whitmore's roof because he allowed it. Annie hated that word, allowed. It was a soft word with a hard door behind it. Charles looked at Lena. Mrs. Bell, your daughter is right. If someone is trying to force me out of my own company, this house will not remain untouched. Neither will anyone in it. Lena's mouth pressed into a thin line. So now fear is everybody's rent. No, Charles said. But I won't lie to you. That mattered, though Lena did not want it to. Annie opened a new document on her laptop. I need the exact nights. Charles rubbed his forehead. Monday, Tuesday, tonight. Same time? Close enough. 11:47 the first night. 11:52 the second. Tonight. 11:49. Were you alone? Yes. Did anyone know you were going upstairs? Charles paused. Everyone knows my routine. That's not the same thing. He studied her again, and this time there was something like respect in it. I had dinner at 7, a call with London at 8. I went to my study until 10:30. I spoke briefly with Brandon in the hall at 11, then I went upstairs. Annie typed as he spoke. What did he say? Charles's gaze moved toward the doorway where his son had gone. He asked if I had reconsidered stepping back from the company. Lena gave a small breath, not quite a laugh. That boy has timing. Charles looked tired. He is still my son. Annie did not answer. She only typed that down too. At 2:40, 1 inches the morning, Lena made coffee, because that was what women like her did when fear entered a room. They found something hot, practical, and familiar. She set a mug in front of Charles without asking whether he wanted it. He accepted it with both hands. Thank you, he said. Lena nodded once. Don't thank me yet. Annie slid the first envelope under the lamp. Tomorrow, I need to see the window. Lena closed her eyes. Lord, help me, and the garden below it, Annie added. And if there are security cameras, I need to know where they point. Charles looked at the letters, then at the girl across from him, the girl Brandon had dismissed as if intelligence required permission. You'll have it. No, Lena said. She'll have school. I can go after school, Annie said. You have work-study applications. I can do both. You always think you can do both. Annie's voice softened. Because you always had to. Lena looked away first. That was the first real silence of the night, not empty but full. Rent, long bus rides, motel bleach, unpaid dental work, Sunday church dresses bought at thrift stores, the kind of American life no billionaire's son ever counted as education. Charles heard it, and something in him shifted. He had spent years believing he understood value because he understood money. Sitting in his kitchen before dawn, he realized money had taught Brandon appetite, while hardship had taught Annie attention. He stood carefully. Go to bed, both of you. We'll speak in the morning. Annie saved her notes. One more question. Charles stopped. Did the letters scare you because they might be true, or because someone wanted them to look true? Lena whispered, Annie. But Charles did not take offense. He looked at the envelopes for a long time. Because someone knew exactly which lie would make me feel alone, he said. Annie nodded. Then that's where we start. When Charles left the kitchen, he carried the letters with him, but Annie had already copied every word. Lena waited until his footsteps reached the stairs before turning to her daughter. You listen to me, she said. Rich people can offer doors, but sometimes those doors lock behind you. I know. No, baby. You know books. I know houses. Annie closed the laptop and stood. Then teach me the house. Lena stared at her daughter for a long second, and despite fear, despite anger, despite every warning life had carved into her, pride broke through. Tomorrow, she said, and you do not go near that window alone. Annie nodded. In the hallway upstairs, a floorboard gave a faint sound, too soft to prove anything. Both women looked toward the ceiling. The house had gone quiet again, but now Annie understood quiet differently. It was not peace. It was a place where someone waited, listened, and planned the next move. By 7 the next morning, Whitmore Estate looked harmless. Sunlight touched the stone walls, the lawn crew trimmed the hedges near the front drive, and the housekeeper's cart rolled softly across the second-floor hall. Annie had slept less than 3 hours, but she still dressed for school in dark jeans, clean sneakers, and the same Howard sweatshirt, because wearing it made her feel like she had already promised herself something. Lena was in the laundry room folding white towels when Annie found her. Eat first, Lena said without turning around. I'm not hungry. That was not a question. Annie took the toast her mother had wrapped in a paper towel and leaned against the dryer. You said you'd teach me the house. I said tomorrow. Unfortunately, tomorrow came. Lena led her through the service corridor, past the pantry, the mudroom, and the side door staff used so guests would never have to see how comfort entered a rich man's home. Mr. Whitmore's bedroom sits over the east garden, Lena said. That window faces the old greenhouse. Nobody goes there much except the gardener, and sometimes Mr. Brandon when he's avoiding daylight. Annie looked at her. You've seen him there? I've seen him everywhere he says he hasn't been. Before Annie could ask more, Brandon appeared at the far end of the corridor, dressed for breakfast in a pale blue shirt and loafers with no socks. He smiled when he saw them, a clean morning smile that made last night seem like something he had folded away. Mrs. Bell, he said. Annie? Busy already? Lena kept her voice even. Good morning, Mr. Brandon. His eyes moved to Annie's backpack. Off to school? Good. Young people should focus on realistic goals. Annie met his gaze. The smile thinned. Then stay out of grown people's problems. Lena stepped closer to her daughter, not in fear, but in warning. We're going to be late. Brandon shifted aside just enough for them to pass. As Annie walked by, she caught the smell of his cologne, sharp and expensive, clinging to the hallway. It was the same scent that had been faint on the third envelope. She did not stop. She did not look back. But inside her mind, she wrote it down. By the time Annie came back from school, the afternoon sun had already slipped behind the trees lining the east side of Whitmore Estate. The house looked unchanged from the outside, stone walls, trimmed hedges, brass fixtures polished by people like her mother, but Annie no longer trusted appearances. Not after the kitchen, not after the letters. She found Lena in the pantry checking inventory sheets. You ate lunch? Lena asked without looking up. Yes. Real lunch? Annie hesitated. Lena sighed. That means no. I had pretzels. That is not lunch. That is surrender. Annie smiled despite herself. Mr. Whitmore said I could see the window after school. Lena stopped writing. I remember. Are you coming? Did I not already tell you not to go alone? 5 minutes later, they were climbing the east staircase. This wing of the house stayed quieter than the rest. Fewer guests came here. Fewer staff passed through. The carpet muted every footstep. Charles was waiting outside his room. He looked better than the night before. Shaved, dressed, tie loosened. But his eyes still carried the color of lost sleep. Thank you for coming, he said. Lena nodded politely. We won't take long. Charles opened the bedroom door. The room was larger than Annie expected, though she had cleaned parts of it before helping her mother. Dark wood shelves, framed photographs, leather chair near the fireplace. One photograph caught her attention immediately. A younger Charles stood beside a woman with soft eyes and a teenage Brandon, all three smiling. She looked away. "The window?" Charles asked. Annie walked toward it. It sat on the east wall overlooking the garden and old greenhouse below. Stone ledges ran beneath it outside. She unlocked it carefully. "No damage," she said. Charles stepped closer. "Security checked already." "Did they check outside?" "Yes." "What did they find?" "Nothing." Annie leaned out slightly. The drop was not impossible. Below stood trimmed hedges, a stone path, and farther out, the greenhouse Lena mentioned that morning. "Someone could stand on the ledge," Annie said. Lena frowned. "At night?" "Maybe." Charles folded his arms. "You think they climbed?" "No." Annie touched the stone frame. "I think they wanted you to think they climbed." Charles looked at her. "The letters came through the window," she continued. "But that doesn't mean the person came from outside." Lena shifted beside her. Annie crouched near the floor beneath the window. "Nothing. No dirt. No leaves. No stone dust. 3 nights in a row and not a trace. Too clean." She stood again. "Can I see the garden?" Charles nodded. The three of them walked downstairs and crossed the east lawn. The greenhouse sat behind a row of shrubs and old climbing vines. Inside, empty pots lined the shelves. Gardening tools hung neatly against the wall. Annie moved slowly, looking, listening. Then she stopped. Near the side entrance, pressed into soft soil beneath the stone edge, was half a shoe print. Not work boots, not gardening shoes. Dress shoes. Expensive ones. Lena saw it too. "That doesn't belong here." Annie crouched. The heel pattern was sharp. Hardly worn. Someone who spent more time indoors than outside. She looked toward the house. The footprint pointed back toward the east wall. "Mr. Whitmore," Annie asked quietly. "Who comes here?" "The gardener sometimes." "Anyone else?" Charles thought for a second. "Not really." Lena crossed her arms. "Mr. Brandon?" Charles hesitated. "Occasionally," he admitted. Before anyone spoke again, footsteps sounded behind them. "Brandon." He came around the side path holding car keys and sunglasses. "Well," he said lightly, "this looks serious." Nobody answered. His eyes dropped. To the footprint. The smile disappeared for half a second, then returned. "Dad," he said, looking at Charles. Board meeting moved up. "Tomorrow morning." Charles frowned. "Why?" "Concern." "About what?" Brandon shrugged. "Your health mostly." Lena went still. Annie watched him. "You told them?" Charles asked. "I mentioned you haven't been sleeping. That was not your decision. I'm trying to help." "By discussing me behind my back?" Brandon removed his sunglasses slowly. "Dad, everyone already sees it." "Sees what?" "You're tired." Silence. Then Brandon glanced toward Annie. "She following you around now?" he asked. "Little detective?" "She's helping me," Charles replied. Brandon laughed softly. "Helping with what? Footprints?" Annie said nothing. Brandon looked at the ground again. At the shoe mark. Too quickly. Then away. Small movement. Easy to miss. She did not miss it. "Anyway," he said, stepping back. "Try not to stay up tonight." He turned. The cologne drifted past Annie again. Same sharp scent. Same as the envelope. Same as the hallway this morning. Her eyes moved to the footprint. Dress shoes. Indoor wear. Expensive cologne. House access. Routine access. And the board suddenly discussing Charles's health. Brandon disappeared toward the driveway. Lena touched Annie's arm lightly. "What are you thinking?" Annie kept watching the path. "I think somebody wants Mr. Whitmore tired enough to look weak." Charles looked at her. "And?" Annie turned back toward the greenhouse. "And I think whoever wrote those letters doesn't need to climb anything." Charles's face tightened. The afternoon had gone quiet again. Wind moved through the hedges. Somewhere deeper inside the house, a door closed. Annie looked once more at the footprint before standing. Then she noticed something else. Caught beneath the edge of the greenhouse step. Black fabric. Thin. Like part of a glove. She bent and picked it up. Lena frowned. "What is that?" Annie turned it over in her hand. "Leather. Expensive. Not gardening material." She slipped it into her pocket. "I don't know yet," she said, but she already had a feeling. And feelings, Annie had learned, were often facts arriving early. Annie kept the piece of black leather in her pocket all through dinner. The household ate separately as always. Charles in the dining room with papers spread beside his plate. Brandon nowhere in sight. Staff meals in the service kitchen. Lena made meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans because it stretched well and tasted even better the next day. "You're chewing without tasting," Lena said. Annie looked up. "You've done that since you were 12, Lena continued. "Whenever your mind runs ahead of you." Annie set down her fork. "The glove wasn't old," Lena sighed. "We're discussing this over meatloaf now? It was expensive leather." "So?" "So it wasn't gardening equipment." Lena folded her napkin carefully. "Baby, rich people lose expensive things every day. Not near footprints under a bedroom window." Lena looked at her daughter for a second. "You already think it's Brandon." Annie did not answer. "That silence means yes. I think he knows more than he says. That is different." "No." Annie looked down at her plate. "I don't think it is." Before Lena could reply, footsteps entered the service hallway. Charles stood there. His tie was gone now. His sleeves rolled up. He looked exhausted. "Mrs. Bell," he said quietly, "do you have coffee left?" Lena stood immediately. "Of course." Annie noticed his hand trembling when he pulled out a chair. "Board meeting?" she asked. Charles nodded once. "How bad?" He let out a breath. "Worse than I expected." Lena placed coffee in front of him. "Thank you." She sat again but did not eat. Charles stared into the mug. 3 directors asked whether I should reduce responsibilities. Annie frowned. 1 suggested temporary medical leave. Lena's fork stopped. "And Brandon?" Annie asked. Charles gave a tired smile without humor. "He said he supported whatever was best for my health." Silence. Lena looked away first. Annie remembered the garden, the footprint, the cologne, the board suddenly discussing health. All roads seemed to point in one direction. Charles rubbed his eyes. "I barely slept 3 hours." "You need rest," Lena said. Charles smiled faintly. "You sound like my doctor." "No, doctors charge more." That earned a small laugh. Then Annie noticed something. Charles's left hand. A folded paper rested beneath it. Not business papers. Notebook paper. "Another letter?" she asked. Charles looked down. "No." He hesitated. "Brandon left this in my study." He slid it across the table. "Dad, you need to think seriously about stepping back. The company cannot survive uncertainty. Neither can you. Love, Brandon." Annie read it twice. Not because of what it said, because of how it said it. "You kept it?" she asked. Charles nodded. "Why?" "Because lately every conversation with my son feels like preparation for something." The room went quiet. Lena reached for the plates. "I'll clean up." "No," Charles said softly. "Leave them." That surprised both women. Charles looked toward the small window over the sink. "When my wife was alive," he said, "we used to eat in here sometimes. She hated the dining room. Said it felt like a bank lobby with silverware." Lena smiled despite herself. "She would sit right there." He pointed to Lena's chair. "Brandon used to do homework on the counter." Annie listened. "He was a good boy," Charles said quietly. "He really was." Nobody answered, because grief had entered the room, and grief deserved silence. After dinner, Charles returned upstairs. Lena washed dishes anyway because some habits survived sadness. Annie carried the black leather piece back to their room. The East Wing room was small but warm. Quilt folded neatly, books stacked beside her bed. The old radio sat on the dresser. She placed the leather under the lamp. Black, soft, fine stitching. She turned it over, stopped. Tiny embossed letters inside. W.H. Whitmore House. Not store branding. House initials. Custom staff issue? No. The house staff used gray work gloves. This belonged to someone else. A knock came. Lena entered carrying folded towels. "You're still at it." Annie handed her the leather. Lena looked, then frowned. "That's not staff equipment." "I know." Lena sat on the bed. "Annie." "What?" "You know what scares me?" Annie waited. "Not the letters." "Then what?" Lena looked toward the door. "The way Mr. Brandon looks at you now." Annie blinked. "He noticed you last night," Lena continued. "Men like him usually don't notice girls like us unless they need something or blame something. I'm not scared of him." "You should be a little." Annie smiled faintly. "That's your answer for everything." "No." Lena touched her hand. "My answer for everything is survive." Before Annie replied, footsteps sounded outside. Fast. Then a door slammed somewhere down the hall. Both women looked up. Voices. Men arguing. Muffled. Upstairs. Annie stood. That's Mr. Whitmore. Lena rose too. The argument grew louder. One voice sharp. One tired. Then clearly. You've already lost the board. Brandon. Silence. Charles answered lower. Too low to hear. Then Brandon again. You think people don't notice? You can't sleep. You forget meetings. You're falling apart. Annie moved to the door. Lena caught her arm. No. But another sentence came through the hall. You need help, Dad. Pause. Or somebody needs to take control. Everything stopped. No footsteps. No voices. Only silence. Annie looked at her mother. Lena's face had gone pale. Because they had both heard it. And sometimes truth arrived before evidence. Late at night. Through walls. In the voice of a son. Annie slowly touched the leather piece in her pocket. Then she remembered Brandon standing in the greenhouse path. His eyes dropping to the footprint. Too fast. Too familiar. Her laptop sat open on the desk. She walked over and typed a new line beneath her notes. Question. Who benefits if Charles Whitmore becomes too sick to lead? She already knew the answer. She just wasn't ready to write his name yet. Annie did not sleep much that night. The voices upstairs had stopped, but silence in Whitmore Estate no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. At 6:30 the next morning she found Charles already in the kitchen. He stood by the coffee machine in a pressed shirt and dark tie, reading the newspaper without turning a page. You're up early, Annie said. Charles lowered the paper. You too. You slept? A little. He lied politely. The shadows under his eyes had deepened. His coffee sat untouched. Annie placed her backpack on the chair. Board meeting today? 9 o'clock. You nervous? Charles gave a short smile. At 50? You stop calling it nervous. You call it preparation. Anya sat down. He folded the paper. I thought about what you said. About what? Someone choosing the lie that would make me feel alone. He looked toward the window. I keep wondering who knows me well enough to do that. Annie thought. Your son. She said nothing. Footsteps entered. Brandon. He looked fresh despite coming home late the previous night. Navy jacket. Watch worth more than Lena's old car. Phone in hand. Morning, he said. Nobody answered immediately. He poured coffee. Big day, he said to Charles. Board's anxious. Charles remained seated. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Brandon finally looked at Annie. Still solving mysteries? Still avoiding sleep? She replied. He smiled. Kute. Lena entered before either spoke again. Breakfast moved quietly after that. Eggs, toast, coffee, normal things trying to survive an abnormal house. At 8:30, Charles left for Manhattan. Brandon left 10 minutes later. Annie watched from the kitchen window as his black sedan rolled down the drive. Then she looked at Lena. I want to see the security room. No. You promised to teach me the house. I promised to teach you survival. Same lesson. Lena sighed. 20 minutes later, they stood outside the security office near the service entrance. The guard on duty, Walter, had worked there longer than Lena. Gray hair, Vietnam veteran chap. Always called Annie college girl. Walter smiled when he saw them. Mrs. Bell. Morning, Walter. His eyes moved to Annie. Scholarship queen. She smiled. Can I ask something? That depends. The East Garden cameras. Walter frowned. Why? Lena answered before Annie could. Mr. Whitmore asked her to help. Walter looked less surprised than expected. He opened the monitor system. Camera 12 covers the east wall. Camera 14 catches the greenhouse path. Annie leaned closer. Can we see Monday night? Walter hesitated, then nodded. The footage appeared. Onbir, Cook Peme, garden empty. 11:46. Still empty. 11:47. Camera black. Annie frowned. What happened? Walter leaned in. That's odd. How long? He checked. 3 minutes. Only that camera? Walter clicked again. Camera 14. Greenhouse path. Black screen. Same time. Annie felt something tighten. Tuesday? Walter rewound. Onbir, 51 PM. Black. Again. Wednesday. Onbir, 48 PM. Black. Again. Nobody spoke. Walter sat back slowly. That shouldn't happen. Annie looked at him. Why not? Backup system. He pointed to the monitor. Even if one goes down. The second records. Did the backup record? Walter checked. Nothing. 3 nights. Same time. No footage. Lena crossed her arms. Who can shut both systems down? Walter hesitated. Security chief. Anyone else? He looked uncomfortable. Family access. Annie felt the room go still. Family. Walter clicked another screen. Wait. The image changed. Interior hallway. Second floor. 11:43 p.m. Monday. Brandon walking toward the east wing. 11:44. Out of frame. 11:58. Returning. Tuesday. Same. Wednesday. Same. Lena whispered. Lord. Walter sat up straighter. That's probably nothing. Nobody believed him. Annie stared at the screen. 3 nights. Same route. Same time. Same missing footage. Brandon coming from the east side. Returning after the letters arrived. Her phone buzzed. Message from Charles. Board meeting delayed. Rough morning. She looked back at the monitor. Walter lowered his voice. Annie, yeah? You didn't get this from me. She nodded. Lena touched her arm. We're done. Outside the security office, neither woman spoke immediately. The winter air felt colder. Finally, Lena stopped walking. You are not accusing him. I didn't. You're thinking it. Annie looked toward the main house. He was there every night. He lives here. The cameras went dark every night. Rich houses break. The board suddenly wants Mr. Whitmore gone. Lena closed her eyes. Babe? Annie lowered her voice. Mom, what if the letters were never about money? Lena opened her eyes. What if they were only meant to make him stop sleeping? Silence. Because they both remembered the shouting upstairs. You're falling apart. You need help. Somebody needs to take control. A black SUV turned into the driveway. Brandon. Too early. He parked fast and stepped out while still on his phone. No, he said sharply into it. Keep them calm until I get there. He stopped when he saw Annie and Lena. The smile appeared instantly. Skipping school? I have early release. Convenient. His eyes moved between them, then toward the security office behind. Small pause. Too small. What are you two doing over here? Lena answered smoothly. Inventory. Brandon looked at Annie. You always carry your laptop for inventory? Annie held his Gaza. You always ask that many questions? The smile disappeared. Not fully. Just enough. His phone rang again. He glanced down. The screen lit briefly. Board chairman. He turned away immediately, but Annie had already seen it. Brandon answered as he walked. Yes, I'm here now. Annie watched him disappear into the house. Then she opened her laptop right there beside the service path. Under question, who benefits if Charles Whitmore becomes too sick to lead? She typed a new line. Who knew the cameras would be off? Answer, someone with family access. Her fingers paused. For the first time since the letters appeared, the empty line beneath the question no longer felt empty. It felt like a name waiting to be admitted. The rest of the afternoon moved like a normal day, pretending nothing was wrong. Lena returned to work. Laundry, guest rooms, inventory sheets. Annie sat in the East Wing room with her laptop open, but the scholarship essay on the screen had become background noise. Who knew the cameras would be off? Someone with family access. She read the sentence again, then added another note. Who benefits from Charles losing control? Before she could type more, her phone buzzed. Message from Charles. Back by 6. Need to speak with you. Nothing else. No period. No signature. Short messages usually meant bad days. At 5:40, Annie walked through the main hall carrying folded towels for Lena. Voices came from Charles's study. The door was not fully closed. Temporary transition plan. Board chairman. Annie recognized the voice from conference calls drifting through the house. Charles answered lower. You're discussing succession while I'm still sitting in the chair. Charles, nobody wants that. Then stop acting like it. Silence. Another voice entered. Brandon. We're trying to protect the company. Annie stopped walking. Protect it from what? Charles asked. Instability. The word hung in the air. Then footsteps. Annie moved immediately, entering the linen room just as Brandon came out. He nearly passed her, then stopped. You always around corners now? He asked. Annie kept folding towels. I live here. His eyes dropped to the notebook beside her. You writing about me? No. Should I be worried? Annie looked up. Are you? For half a second his smile slipped, then came back. Careful, Annie. About what? People see what they expect to see. He stepped closer, and sometimes girls from small rooms get confused inside big houses. The cologne hit her again. Sharp, clean, expensive, exactly like the envelope. Not similar. Sama. Her eyes lowered without meaning to. His gloves sat tucked into his coat pocket. Black leather, one missing at the fingertip. Annie went still. He noticed. His hand moved immediately. Too late. What? He asked. Nothing. Brandon smiled. No, you saw something. He took the gloves out, turned them in his hand. Gift from my father, he said casually. Custom made. Nice, right? Annie said nothing, because the missing edge matched the leather piece in her drawer upstairs. Footsteps approached. Lena. Brandon stepped back at once. Mrs. Bell. Mr. Brandon. He smiled again. Different smile now. Public smile. We were talking. Lena looked at Annie. About what? Brandon answered first. College. Then he walked away. Lena waited until his footsteps disappeared. What happened? Annie lowered her voice. The glove. What glove? The leather piece. Lena stared. It matches. They stood in silence. Across the hall, a clock struck 6. Downstairs, the front door opened. Charles. He entered the kitchen 10 minutes later. Tie loosened. Face pale. Annie noticed immediately. You okay? Charles sat without answering. Lena placed coffee in front of him. He pushed it aside. That bad? She asked quietly. Charles rubbed his forehead. The board wants a health evaluation. Nobody spoke. They say it's routine. It isn't, Lena said. No. Annie sat opposite him. Who suggested it? Charles looked up. Brandon. Silence. He says it would calm investors. Lena crossed her arms. That boy. Charles leaned back. He keeps saying he's helping. Annie thought about the gloves, the cameras, the letters, the board chair calling him, the late-night argument. Then she asked carefully, Did Brandon know about your heart condition? Charles looked at her. Yes. Who else? My doctor, my late wife, Brandon. Lena stopped moving. Annie kept her voice steady. The third letter mentioned your heart. Charles said nothing. You said the letters scared you because they knew which lie would make you feel alone. Still silence. Annie continued. What if it wasn't a lie? Charles looked up sharply. What do you mean? What if whoever wrote them knew exactly what to say because they already knew you? Lena whispered, Annie. But Charles did not stop her. He sat very still, like a man hearing his own thoughts spoken aloud. Then footsteps entered the hall. Brandon again. He came in carrying car keys. Dad. I'm heading out. Charles looked at him. Where? Dinner. It's Tuesday. So? With who? Brandon smiled. You sound like Mom. The room went quiet, because nobody mentioned Charles's wife anymore. Not like that. Brandon seemed to realize it too late. He cleared his throat. I'll be back later. Charles spoke before he reached the door. Did you recommend the health evaluation? Brandon froze, then turned. Yes. Why? Because you need help. I need sleep. You need both. Charles stood. Not angry, just tired. Did you ever think maybe I stopped sleeping because somebody wanted me afraid? Brandon laughed softly. Dad. No. Answer me. The room held still. Brandon looked at Annie first, then back at Charles. You think I'd do something like that? Nobody answered. He smiled, but this time even the smile looked tired. I love you, he said quietly. You know that. Then he left. The front door closed. Car engine. Silence. Charles sat down again. Lena touched his shoulder once before leaving the room. Annie stayed. On the table beside Charles lay his phone. The screen lit. New message. From board chairman. Brandon says you had another sleepless night. We need to move quickly. Annie saw it. Charles saw her seeing it. Neither spoke. Outside the kitchen windows, evening settled over the east garden. Somewhere beyond the greenhouse, the path disappeared into shadow. Annie thought of the glove, the missing piece, the scent. Then she opened her laptop. Under the question she had avoided all day, she finally typed the name, Brandon Whitmore, Hefingahova, then pressed save. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked again. The house had gone quiet, but Annie no longer thought quiet meant waiting. Now it sounded like someone running out of time. Annie barely touched her homework that night. The name sat on her laptop screen. Brandon Whitmore. Saved, not proven. She kept staring at it anyway. At 9:30, Lena came into the room carrying folded laundry. You're doing it again. Doing what? Thinking so hard you forget your face. Annie closed the laptop halfway. Lena set the clothes down. Talk. Annie hesitated. The gloves match. I know. The cameras were off. I know. He was there every night. Lena sat on the edge of the bed, and Mr. Whitmore still loves him. The room went quiet, because that was the problem. Not evidence. Love. Annie leaned back in her chair. Why doesn't he see it? Lena gave a tired smile. Baby, parents don't stop seeing the child, even when everybody else sees the man. Before Annie could answer, footsteps sounded outside. Heavy. Slow. Not Brandon. Charles. A knock followed. Come in, Lena said. Charles entered holding a file folder. You busy? Annie closed the laptop completely. No. He remained standing. I need your opinion. Lena looked surprised. Charles opened the folder and handed Annie several printed pages. Medical evaluation request. Board recommendation. Temporary executive transition plan. Her eyes stopped. Interim authority. Brandon Whitmore. She looked up. Charles watched her carefully. What do you think? Lena spoke first. I think they move fast. Charles nodded once. Too fast. Annie kept reading. Dates. Meeting notes. Recommendations. Then one sentence caught her eye. Prepared with input from family representatives. Family, meaning Brandon. When did he know about this? She asked. Charles sat down. Maybe a week. A week? He said he wanted options ready. Lena let out a breath. Lord help us. Charles looked toward the door. He thinks I'm slipping. You think that? Annie asked. He did not answer immediately. Then quietly, I forget things now. Lena shook her head. You forget because you haven't slept. I lost my temper at the board. You're human. I reread the same contract 3 times yesterday. Annie leaned forward. Because someone kept you awake for 3 nights. Charles looked at her. You still think the letters are connected? Yes. Even now? Especially now. Silence. Charles rubbed his hands together. Annie. He stopped. What? I don't want it to be him. The room softened. Because that sentence was not about evidence. It was grief arriving early. Annie lowered her voice. I know. Charles looked away. His mother used to say Brandon loved too easily. Friends. Parties. Attention. Everything became important for 10 minutes. He smiled faintly. She worried the world would reward him for charm before it punished him for character. Lena listened quietly. She died before finding out. Nobody spoke. The old radio on the dresser hummed softly in the background. Some jazz station Lena liked. Charles stood again. Good night. He reached the door. Stopped. Without turning around, he said, If you find something, tell me the truth. Then he left. Lena waited until the footsteps disappeared. He knows. Annie looked at her. Not everything, Lena continued, but enough to be afraid. At 11:30 the house settled. Lights out. Doors closed. The east wing quiet. Annie sat by the window with her laptop open again. Questions filled the screen. Why the gloves? Why the cameras? Why the board? Then another thought came. The letters. She reopened the copied text. Read them again. First letter. Money. Second. IRS. Board. Third. Heart. Escalation. Not random. Planned. Someone building pressure. Her eyes narrowed. She opened a new note. Letter writer knew. Money concerns. Board timing. Heart condition. House routine. Camera access. Family knowledge. She stopped. Footsteps outside. Fast. Annie stood immediately. The hallway was empty. But downstairs. Front door. Soft. Closing. She checked the clock. 11. 43 p.m. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed her sweater and slipped into the hall. The main staircase stood dark. She moved quietly. Down one flight. Then stopped. Through the glass near the east entrance, she saw movement. Outside. Near the garden path. A man. Dark coat. Walking toward the greenhouse. Annie held her breath. The figure paused. Turned slightly. Moonlight caught the side of his face. Brandon. He kept moving. Straight toward the east garden. Toward the path beneath Charles's window. Annie followed. Not outside. Inside. Parallel hallway. Every step careful. Through the glass panels she watched him. He reached the greenhouse, looked around, then bent down. Her heart kicked. He picked something up. Small, white, envelope. Annie froze. Brandon slipped it into his coat, then checked his watch. 11:40 p.m. The exact time of the first letter. He looked once toward Charles's bedroom, then turned back toward the house. Annie moved immediately. Back. Stairs. Hall. Room. She shut the door seconds before footsteps entered the east wing. Passed. Continued. Silence. Lena sat up in bed. Annie? Annie was breathing hard. What happened? She looked at her mother. For the first time since this began, certainty felt heavier than suspicion. He was there, Annie whispered. Lena straightened. Who? Annie looked toward the ceiling. Brandon. The radio hummed softly in the dark. Somewhere upstairs a door closed. And inside Annie's mind, the line between possibility and truth had just become very thin. Lena sat upright in bed. You saw him? Annie nodded. Outside. East garden. Near the greenhouse. Lena pulled the blanket aside and stood. What was he doing? Annie shook her head. I don't know. He picked something up. What? An envelope. The room went still. Lena looked toward the door. You're sure? I saw him. Maybe it wasn't what you think. Annie looked down. Mom, it was 11:47. Lena had no answer for that. Neither woman slept after that. At 6 the next morning, Annie opened her laptop and added another line beneath Brandon's name. Seen in East Garden. 11:47 p.m. Picked up white envelope. She stared at it. Still not proof, but no longer coincidence. The house woke slowly around them. Coffee. Doors. Footsteps. Staff arriving. Somewhere downstairs, the radio in the service kitchen played old jazz again. At breakfast, Charles was already seated. Newspaper open. Coffee untouched. Brandon entered 5 minutes later wearing a dark suit. He looked rested. Too rested. Morning, he said. Charles nodded. Lena placed eggs on the table. Nobody moved immediately. Then Brandon looked at Annie. You look tired. I didn't sleep much. Studying? No. His smile held. Me neither. Annie looked at him. Last night he had walked through the garden carrying an envelope. This morning he looked like a man heading into a meeting. Charles folded the paper. Bored again today? Brandon sat down. Brief meeting. You seem busy lately. Brandon shrugged. Company doesn't pause because people are tired. The sentence landed harder than he intended. Charles's hand stopped moving. Lena looked down at the coffee pot. Annie watched Brandon. He noticed. What? You keep talking about Mr. Whitmore being tired. Brandon smiled lightly. He is. That worries you? It should worry everyone. Charles finally spoke. Enough. Silence. Breakfast ended quickly. Charles left first. Brandon stayed behind. Lena carried dishes to the sink. Annie closed her laptop. Annie. She looked up. Brandon stood near the doorway. Walk with me. Lena immediately turned. No. Brandon smiled. Relax. I'm not kidnapping her. Lena's face stayed flat. Annie stood anyway. They stepped into the hallway. Brandon waited until the kitchen disappeared behind them. Then his smile vanished. You were following me. Annie said nothing. Last night. Still nothing. He looked toward the windows. You should be careful. About what? Making stories. You seem worried about my stories. His jaw tightened. I know girls like you. Annie looked at him. Girls like me? Smart. Quiet. Always watching. He smiled again. You think attention makes you powerful. No. Then what? I think attention keeps people honest. The smile disappeared completely. Brandon stepped closer. You live here because my father lets you. Annie held his gaze. My mother works here. Exactly. Silence. Then Brandon lowered his voice. If he loses the company, this house changes. Staff changes. Arrangements change. Annie understood immediately. Not a threat. A reminder. People with money rarely threatened first. They forecasted. Lena appeared at the end of the hall before Annie answered. Annie. Brandon stepped back instantly. Public face returning. See you later, he said softly. He walked away. Lena waited until he disappeared. What did he say? Nothing new. That boy scares me. Annie looked toward the front drive. He's scared too. At noon, Annie skipped study hall and returned to the greenhouse. The soil near the path still held the shoe mark. The place where Brandon Bent last night sat undisturbed. She crouched, looked closer. There, half buried under leaves. Paper, folded, small. Her pulse jumped. She picked it up carefully. Blank outside. Inside, not a letter. Receipt. Luxury stationery store. 3 purchases. Cream envelopes. Premium paper. Black ink cartridges. Date. 4 days ago. Customer initials. V. Annie stopped breathing. Footsteps sounded behind her. She hid the receipt immediately. Charles stood near the path. You skip school? Study period. He smiled faintly. That sounded rehearsed. She stood. What are you doing here? Trying to remember when this place stopped feeling peaceful. He looked older today. More tired. Annie almost told him. The receipt. The initials. Everything. Instead, she asked, Do you come here often? Used to. He looked inside the greenhouse. My wife liked it. Silence. She planted tomatoes every summer. Small smile. Brandon hated gardening. Annie looked down. He used to complain the dirt ruined his shoes. Her fingers tightened around the receipt in her pocket. Charles continued quietly. Funny what parents remember, Annie thought. And funny what children become. Back at the house, she locked herself in the East Wing room and opened her laptop. Under Brandon's name, she added, Receipt found near greenhouse. Cream envelopes. Premium paper. Initials, BW. Her hand stopped, because BW could mean Brandon Whitmore, or Charles's late wife, or Whitmore branding. Not proof. Again. Always almost. A knock came. Lena entered carrying folded sheets. Mr. Whitmore asked for you tonight. Why? Dinner. Annie frowned. Just us? Lena nodded. He said he wants to talk. Outside their window, the east garden sat quiet beneath the afternoon light. The greenhouse door moved slightly in the wind, and inside Annie's drawer, hidden beneath scholarship papers, lay a receipt that felt less like evidence and more like a countdown. Dinner started later than usual. Charles had chosen the small breakfast room instead of the dining hall. Lena noticed immediately. Rich people moved to smaller rooms when they were tired of performing. The table held roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, cornbread Lena made that afternoon, and a bottle of iced tea sweating onto the placemat. Only 4 chairs. Charles sat at one end. Annie beside her mother. Brandon arrived last. He looked annoyed before he even sat down. What is this? He asked. Dinner, Charles replied. I have plans. Cancel them. Brandon looked at him. Charles did not look back. The room settled into silence. Lena served food because that was what she did when people forgot how to be civil. Charles barely touched his plate. Brandon noticed. You should eat. I know. You haven't been eating enough. Lena stopped moving. The sentence sounded caring. Too caring. Annie watched Charles instead. His hand rested beside the fork. Still. Tired. Brandon leaned back. Board meeting again tomorrow. Charles nodded once. We should talk tonight. No. Brandon looked up. No? Charles took a sip of tea. Not tonight. Brandon laughed softly. Dad, this isn't optional anymore. The room quieted. Lena looked at Annie. Annie looked at Charles. Charles finally raised his eyes. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Or because you want it true. Brandon's face changed. Small shift. Enough. What's that supposed to mean? Charles folded his napkin carefully. You tell me. Nobody moved. Brandon looked around the table. At Annie. At Lena. Back to Charles. This is because of her, isn't it? Annie froze. Brandon, Charles warned. No. He pointed toward Annie. Ever since she got involved, you've been acting like everybody in this house is lying. Charles stood. The chair moved sharply against the floor. Sit down. Brandon did not. Dad, she's a kid. She's 18. She's staff. The word landed hard. Lena lowered her eyes. Annie felt it anyway. Charles's face went still. No, he said quietly. Her mother works here. Annie lives here. Brandon laughed once. Same difference. Lena stood. Excuse me. She picked up plates. Charles stopped her. Mrs. Bell. She paused. You sit down. Lena looked surprised. Charles's voice remained calm. You cooked. You stay. Brandon shook his head. You're embarrassing yourself. Charles turned slowly. No. Silence. You're embarrassing me. The room stopped. Brandon stared at him. For the first time since Annie met Charles, the father sounded less tired than disappointed. Brandon pushed back his chair. Fine. He grabbed his keys. Keep listening to her. Then he left. Front door. Car engine. Gone. Nobody spoke for a while. Charles sat down again. He looked older now. Lena quietly placed his plate back in front of him. Eat, she said. He almost smiled. After dinner, Charles asked Annie to walk with him. They crossed the east hallway slowly. The house had gone quiet again. You found something, Charles said. Annie looked at him. I can tell. She hesitated. The receipt sat folded in her pocket. Heavy. Not because of paper. Because of consequence. Maybe, she answered. Charles nodded. Does it involve Brandon? Silence. He stopped walking. Annie. She looked up. I need the truth. The hallway lights cast long shadows across the floor. Annie reached into her pocket. The receipt touched her fingers. Then, voices. From the study. Men. Charles frowned. The study door stood partly open. Inside, 2 directors from the board sat with Brandon. Nobody expected Charles. Nobody expected Annie. Conversation stopped immediately. Charles looked around. What is this? Board chairman stood. We were waiting. For what? Brandon remained seated. For the evaluation discussion. Charles looked at the clock. 8:30. You scheduled board business in my house? Nobody answered. Then Brandon stood. Dad, we need to move forward. With what? The transition. The word hit the room. Charles stared at him. What transition? Board chairman cleared his throat. Temporary authority shift. Charles looked slowly around the room. At the files, at the folders, at the prepared documents, everything already arranged. His face lost color. Annie saw it happen. The realization, this had moved further than he knew. Brandon stepped closer. Dad. No. Charles backed away once. Only once. You did this already. Because you need help. You prepared this before asking me. Silence. Board chairman lowered his eyes. That was answer enough. Charles looked at his son. Since when? Brandon did not answer. Since when? Finally. A few weeks. The room went still. A few weeks. Before the letters. Before the sleepless nights. Before the fear. Annie felt the receipt inside her pocket like fire. Charles laughed softly. Not happy. Broken. A few weeks. He looked toward the window. Toward the east garden beyond it. Then quietly, you were already planning my replacement. Brandon stepped forward. Dad, listen. No. Charles turned. His voice stayed calm. Too calm. You go. Dad. You go. Nobody moved. Then board chairman gathered his papers. One by one they left. Brandon remained last. At the door he looked back. Not at Charles. At Annie. Only a second. Then he left too. The study became silent. Charles stood by the window. Hands in pockets, looking toward the greenhouse. Annie stayed near the door. After a long time he spoke. My wife used to say money teaches people to count everything. He smiled faintly. She worried Brandon would count too. He looked down. I never thought he would count me. Annie lowered her eyes. The receipt remained hidden. Not tonight. Tonight he had already lost enough. Outside the study windows, the east garden lay still beneath the lights. And somewhere between the greenhouse and the house, truth kept moving closer. Charles stayed in the study long after everyone left. Annie remained too. Neither spoke. The folders still sat open across the table. Transition plans. Evaluation forms. Temporary authority drafts. Papers written by people who preferred signatures over conversations. Charles finally sat down. Slowly, like the room had become heavier. Go get some sleep, he said. Annie did not move. You should too. He smiled faintly. I forgot how teenagers answer. You asked me for the truth. Charles looked at her. And I still owe you one. Silence. Annie reached into her pocket. The folded receipt touched her fingers again. Before she could decide, footsteps approached. Lena. She stood at the doorway. Mr. Whitmore? Charles looked up. There's coffee in the kitchen. He almost laughed. At this hour? Lena shrugged. Fear doesn't check clocks. That finally pulled him out of the chair. The three of them walked back toward the kitchen. The house had gone quiet again. Only the old clock and distant pipes moving through the walls. Lena poured coffee. Charles sat. Annie remained standing. Then headlights crossed the kitchen window. Car. Brandon. Back. Nobody spoke. The front door opened. Footsteps. Not rushed. Confident. Brandon entered carrying his jacket over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw them. Still awake? Charles looked at him. You left. You told me to. You came back. I live here. Silence. Brandon loosened his tie. Then his eyes moved to the folders still in Charles's hand. You kept them. Charles set the papers down. Sit. Brandon hesitated, then sat. Lena quietly stepped back toward the counter. Annie stayed near the table. Charles folded his hands. When were you going to tell me? Brandon leaned back. About what? The transition plan. Dad. No. Charles looked directly at him. When? Brandon looked away first. A month. The kitchen went still. Lena stopped drying the cup in her hand. Charles did not move. A month? You were already slipping. Annie saw Charles flinch. Small. Almost invisible. Brandon kept talking. You missed meetings. I missed one. You forgot numbers. I forgot a date. You stopped sleeping. After the letters. Silence. Brandon looked up. Too fast. Annie noticed. Charles noticed too. After what? Charles asked quietly. Brandon blinked. The stress. No. Charles leaned forward. You said after the letters. Nobody moved. Brandon smiled. Thin smile. Dad, everybody knows now. Charles stared at him. The kitchen air changed. Annie felt it. That tiny shift when somebody realized they had stepped wrong. Brandon stood. You're tired. Answer me. You told people. I told nobody. Lena looked at Annie. Annie looked at Brandon. He laughed once. You think I'm the problem now? Charles remained seated. You knew about the letters before tonight. No. You said it. I guessed. You guessed the word letters? Brandon grabbed his jacket. This is insane. He turned. Then Annie spoke. You were in the East Garden last night. Silence. Brandon stopped. Lena closed her eyes. Charles looked at Annie. Slowly. Brandon turned back. What? You heard me. His expression did not change. Only his hands. One tightened around the jacket. You followed me? I saw you. No, you imagined me. You picked something up near the greenhouse. Brandon laughed. God. He looked at Charles. This is what she's doing. Charles did not answer. Brandon stepped closer. You're letting her poison this house. Annie held his gaza. You knew the cameras were off. His eyes changed. There. Gone. Back again. What cameras? East Garden. Brandon smiled. Cute theory. Annie reached into her pocket. The receipt. She placed it on the table. Nobody moved. Charles picked it up. Cream envelopes. Premium paper. Black ink. Initials. B.W. The room stopped breathing. Brandon looked at it, then laughed. Actually laughed. B.W. He shook his head. My mother was Beth Whitmore. Silence. Annie went cold. Charles lowered the paper. Brandon stepped toward the table. You thought this was me? He looked at Annie. Seriously? Lena stared at the receipt. Annie suddenly hated the paper. Because he was right. Not proof. Never proof. Brandon looked at Charles. This is what I mean. His voice softened. Dad. She's a kid chasing shadows. Charles remained still. Brandon turned toward Annie. Next time you accuse someone, bring facts. Then he left. Front door. Silence. Car engine. Gone again. Nobody spoke. The receipt still lay on the table. Harmless now. Useless. Lena sat down slowly. Annie stared at it. I'm sorry. Charles looked at her. You believed you were helping. I was wrong. No. He folded the receipt once. You were early. Annie looked up. Charles stood. Tired. Older. But not wrong. Lena frowned. Charles placed the paper back down. He knew the word letters. Silence. He said it before I did. The room froze. Annie replayed it. After the letters. Not after the stress. Not after the problem. Letters. Charles looked toward the window. The question is why? Nobody answered. Outside, beyond the glass, the East Garden sat beneath the lights. The greenhouse door moved slightly in the wind, and somewhere inside Whitmore Estate, A man had just realized he was no longer speaking carefully enough. The kitchen stayed quiet long after Brandon left. Charles remained by the table. The receipt still lay between the coffee cups. Lena finally stood. "I'll clean up." Charles shook his head. "Leave it." She hesitated, then nodded and walked toward the sink anyway, because grief, fear, and dishes had one thing in common. Somebody still had to handle them. Annie sat without moving. "He knew," Charles said quietly. Nobody answered. He knew before anyone should have. Lena dried her hands slowly. Maybe he guessed. Charles looked at the window. "My son doesn't guess." The sentence carried something new. Not anger, recognition. At 10:30, everyone went upstairs. Nobody slept. Annie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. At 11:41, she sat up. The clock glowed red beside her bed. She danced Girlℹ. Her pulse quickened. She stood. "Lena stirred." "Annie?" "I'm checking the window." "No." But Annie was already at the door. She moved quietly through the east hall, past the staircase, past the library, toward Charles's room. The door stood slightly open. Light inside. Charles was awake, sitting in the chair near the window, waiting. He looked up when Annie entered. "You too?" She nodded. Neither explained. "She danced Girlℹ." Silence. The garden lights glowed below. "She danced Girlℹ." Nothing. "She danced Girlℹ." Still nothing. Annie let out a breath. Then, movement. Greenhouse path. Someone. Dark coat. Fast. Charles stood. The figure stopped beneath the east wall. Raised an arm. Something white flashed. Envelope. It hit the window. The sound cracked through the room. The figure turned and ran. Charles moved first. Annie followed. Down the stairs. Through the east entrance. Cold air. Garden lights. Footsteps ahead. The figure disappeared near the greenhouse. Charles slowed suddenly. One hand against the wall. "Sir? I'm fine." He wasn't. Annie grabbed his arm. "You stay." "No." "Yes." For the first time since this began, she sounded like she expected obedience. Charles looked at her, then stopped. Annie ran. Past the greenhouse. Past the hedges. Nothing. No figure. No footsteps. Only one thing. A phone. Lying near the path. She picked it up. Locked screen. Black case. Initials embossed in silver. V. Her heart kicked. Footsteps behind. Lena. She had followed. What happened? Annie showed her the phone. Lena went still. Lord. Charles reached them seconds later. Breathing hard, Annie handed him the new envelope first. He opened it. One line. "You should have stepped down sooner." Silence. Then, music. Phone vibrating. Incoming call. Screen lit. Board chairman. Nobody moved. The phone kept ringing. Charles stared at it. Lena looked at Annie. Annie looked at the initials again. V. The call ended. Immediately another message appeared. "Need confirmation before tomorrow. Board ready." The world seemed to stop. Charles read it once. Then again. His face emptied. Note shock. Something worse. Acceptance arriving. Lena whispered. "Mr. Whitmore." He handed the phone to Annie. Hands shaking. "This was here?" "Yes." "Near where the person ran?" "Yes." Nobody spoke, because they all understood. Not proof of the letters. Not yet, but proof of presence, proof of planning, proof of movement. Charles looked toward the greenhouse. "The board meeting is tomorrow." Annie frowned. "What meeting?" He smiled without humor. "Emergency session." Lena stared. "Tomorrow?" "They're voting." Silence. "On what?" Annie asked. Charles looked at the phone. "My replacement." Wind moved through the trees. The greenhouse door creaked softly. Annie looked down at the message again. Board ready. Not considering. Ready. Then another thought arrived. She unlocked the Notes app. One draft. Saved. Title. Dad transition timeline. Inside. Meeting dates. Health review notes. Board contacts. And one entry from 3 weeks earlier. Letters begin. Sleep decline. Push evaluation. Annie stopped breathing. Charles took the phone. Read it. Once. Twice. The night seemed to disappear from his face. He looked old suddenly. Not 50. Older. Because betrayal aged people faster than years. Lena touched his shoulder. He did not move. Annie looked toward the greenhouse. toward the path, toward the place where the figure disappeared. Then quietly, he planned it. Charles closed the phone. His voice came out low. No. Annie looked at him. He planned me. Nobody spoke. Back inside the house, the old clock struck midnight. The lights in the east garden stayed on. The envelope remained in Charles's hand. And for the first time since the first letter appeared, suspicion had changed shape. It now had evidence. And a name. Nobody returned to sleep after that. Charles locked Brandon's phone inside the study safe. The new letter remained on his desk. You should have stepped down sooner. At 6:30, the house woke to a normal morning that no longer belonged to normal people. Coffee brewed. Staff arrived. The lawn crew trimmed hedges. And inside Whitmore Estate, everyone waited. Charles came downstairs already dressed for Manhattan. Dark suit. Silver tea. No newspaper. No breakfast. Lena noticed first. You need to eat. I'm not hungry. That is not an answer. He almost smiled. Almost. Annie entered the kitchen carrying her laptop. Charles looked at her. You're coming with me. Lena stopped pouring coffee. What? Charles sat down. The board meeting. Silence. Annie blinked. Sir. I want you there. Brandon entered at that exact moment. The room froze. His eyes moved from Charles to Annie. To where? Charles looked directly at him. The emergency session. Brandon laughed softly. You're bringing her? Yes. This is a board meeting, not a school project. Lena lowered the coffee pot slowly. Charles stood. This is my company. Silence. I decide who walks in. Brandon smiled. But Annie saw it. The tension. Tiny. Real. He sat anyway. Fina. Breakfast happened in fragments after that. Nobody touched much food. At 8:30 the cars left for Manhattan. Charles in front. Annie beside him. Brandon in another car behind. The city appeared slowly beyond the highway. Glass towers. Traffic. Morning crowds. Whitmore Financial stood in Midtown like a building built to remind people who won. Inside, executives lowered their voices when Charles entered. Annie noticed. Yes. Whispers. Watching. Boardroom doors opened at 9. Long table. Leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Board chairman stood first. Charles. No smile. No warmth. Only procedure. Charles entered. Annie behind him. Brandon stopped. What is she doing here? Charles removed his coat. She stays. Board chairman frowned. This is inappropriate. No, Charles said calmly. This is witness. The room quieted. Meeting began. Health reports. Performance charts. Market concerns. Words dressed as concern. Then board chairman opened the final folder. Recommendation for temporary executive transition. Interim authority. Brandon Whitmore. Charles did not touch the paper. Board chairman looked up. We believe this is best. For who? Charles asked. Nobody answered. Brandon leaned forward. Dad. No. The word cut through the room. Charles stood. Slowly. He looked around the table. 3 weeks ago this process started. Silence. 3 weeks ago my son began preparing my replacement. Brandon's jaw tightened. Board chairman shifted. Charles continued. Then anonymous letters appeared. The room moved. Eyes. Looks. Whispers. Brandon stood immediately. Dad. No. Charles reached into his briefcase. Phone. Brandon's phone. Placed on the table. Silence. Nobody moved. Board chairman looked at it. Brandon stopped breathing. Charles opened the notes app. Dad transition timeline. Letters begin. Sleep decline. Push evaluation. The room went dead quiet. Board chairman sat back. Brandon laughed suddenly. Too fast. That proves nothing. Charles looked at him. You lost this in the garden. I lost lots of things. Near my window? Brandon looked toward Annie. There it was again. Anger. Not fear. Anger. He pointed at her. She followed me. Nobody answered. She's been in my business for days. Still silence. She's staff. The word hit harder here. In the boardroom, in front of men who had never cleaned a floor. Annie felt it. So did Charles. Charles turned. Stand up. Brandon blinked. What? Stand. Brandon stood. Charles looked at the board. My son just called the girl who protected me staff as if dignity came with salary levels. Nobody moved. Charles continued. She found what security missed. His eyes moved to Annie. She noticed what I ignored. Then back to Brandon. And she stayed when my own son planned my replacement. Brandon slammed a hand onto the table. I planned because you were failing. Silence. Nobody breathed. Charles looked at him. You admit it? You were falling apart. Because of the letters. You were already weak. The room stopped. Brandon realized it. Too late. Already spoken. Board chairman slowly turned. Charles remained still. Brandon's face lost color. You knew, Charles said quietly. No. You knew before anyone. I meant, you knew. Silence. Then Annie stood. Everyone looked at her. Her voice stayed calm. Mr. Whitmore was losing sleep exactly when the letters started. She looked at Brandon. The cameras went dark every night. She placed the black leather piece on the table. This matched his glove. Then the receipt, found near the greenhouse. Then quietly. And I saw him there at 11:47. Nobody spoke. Board chairman looked at Brandon. For the first time, not as successor. As question. Brandon stepped back. This is insane. Charles looked at him. No. Silence. This is betrayal. The boardroom windows reflected the city behind them. Cons moving. People working. Life continuing. Inside the room, a father stood across from his son and finally saw him without memory protecting the view. Brandon looked around. No allies. No smiles. No control. Then he walked out, door closing hard behind him. Nobody followed. Charles sat down slowly. His hands trembled. Board chairman closed the transition file. Without a word, Annie looked at Charles. He stared at the empty chair where Brandon had sat. Then quietly, meeting adjourned. But nobody moved, because everybody understood. The vote had ended before it began. Nobody spoke on the drive back to Connecticut. Charles sat in the rear seat looking out the window. Annie sat across from him. His phone rang twice. Board chairman. Ignored. 3 directors. Ignored. Lena called once. He answered only that. We're coming home. Nothing else. Whitmore Estate looked unchanged when they arrived. Stone walls. Garden lights. Perfect lawn. The same house. Different people walking into it. Lena waited near the front entrance. The moment she saw Charles's face, she stopped asking questions. What happened? Charles handed her the car keys. It's over. Lena looked at Annie. Annie nodded once. Inside the house, nobody moved toward dinner. Nobody mentioned food. Charles went directly to the study. The door stayed open. That worried Annie more than if he had locked it. At 7:30, the front door opened. Brandon. He walked in carrying anger like luggage. The moment he saw Annie in the hall, he stopped. You. Annie stood still. He laughed once. You happy? Charles appeared behind them. Enough. Brandon turned. You embarrassed me. Charles looked at him quietly. You embarrassed yourself. Silence. Brandon stepped forward. That girl poisoned you. No. She followed me. She dug through my things. No. She turned the board against me. Charles's voice remained calm. No. Brandon stared. Then what? Charles looked at his son for a long time. You did. The house went silent. Lena stood near the dining room doorway. Hands folded tightly. Brandon laughed again. Different laugh now. Sharper. So that's it? Charles did not answer. You choose her? Stop. No. Brandon pointed toward Annie. Say it. You believe her over me? Charles stepped closer. I believe what I saw. What did you see? A man planning my replacement before I knew I was being replaced. Brandon's face hardened. You were weak. Lena shut her eyes. Charles did not move. You wanted me sick? Silence. The question stayed in the room. Heavy. Still. Brandon looked away first. You were already falling apart. You wanted me afraid? No answer. You wanted me awake every night? Brandon's jaw tightened. You think I wrote those letters? Charles stared at him. You tell me. Nobody breathed. Then, yes. Lena gasped softly. Annie went still. Brandon laughed once after saying it, as if hearing himself. You know what? He looked at Charles. Yes. Silence. You wouldn't step down. Charles did not move. The board was waiting. Investors were asking questions. You kept acting like nothing changed. So you terrorized me? I pushed you. You threatened me. I accelerated reality. The words hit harder than shouting. Charles looked at his son. Not angry now. Broken. Brandon kept talking. You built everything around yourself. He spread his hands. What happens when you die? What happens then? Charles whispered. So you tried to hurry it? Silence. Brandon looked away. Too late. Already answered. Lena pressed a hand over her mouth. Annie felt cold, because truth always sounded smaller than fear imagined it. Charles sat down slowly. He looked suddenly tired in a way sleep could never fix. Me God. Nobody spoke. Brandon stood there, still proud, still angry, still believing he was practical. Charles raised his head. You're done. What? You heard me. Brandon laughed. No. Yes. This house is mine too. No. Charles looked directly at him. Not anymore. Silence. You lose inheritance rights today. Brandon froze. You can't do that. I can. You're choosing her. Charles stood. No. His eyes moved toward Annie. Then back. I'm choosing decency. The room stopped. Brandon looked around. No support. No allies. Only Lena standing beside her daughter. Only Annie standing beside truth. Only his father standing against him. You'll regret this, Brandon said quietly. Charles shook his head. No. He walked to the study, opened the safe, returned with a folder, placed it on the hall table. Estate documents, trust revisions. Brandon stared. Charles's voice remained steady. You leave tonight. This is insane. No. You're throwing away your son. Charles looked at him one last time. No. Silence. You threw me away first. Nobody moved. Brandon grabbed his keys, his jacket, nothing else. At the door he stopped, looked toward Annie. For a second she thought he would speak. He didn't. The door closed. Car engine. Gone. The house stood still. Lena quietly sat down. Charles remained standing, eyes on the front door. Minutes passed. Then Annie moved toward him. Sir. He raised a hand gently. Not now. He walked into the study, left the door open. Lena looked at Annie. He loved that boy. Annie nodded. I know. Lena looked toward the study. Parents bury many things for their children. Her voice lowered. Sometimes truth is the last thing left. Outside the windows, the east garden lights glowed. The greenhouse stood empty. No footsteps. No envelopes. No waiting. Only quiet. Real quiet this time. And upstairs in the study, a father sat alone learning the cost of finally seeing clearly. The house stayed quiet for 3 days after Brandon left. No late footsteps. No doors closing at midnight. No envelopes beneath windows. Whitmore Estate felt different now, as if fear had packed a suitcase and followed the wrong son out the front door. Charles returned to work on Monday. No board transition. No medical review. Board chairman personally withdrew the recommendation. Nobody said Brandon's name anymore. Not at the office. Not at home. Especially not at home. On Wednesday night, Annie sat in the kitchen again. Laptop open. Scholarship essay unfinished. The same lamp above her. The same table. Different silence. Lena stood at the stove stirring soup. You've rewritten that paragraph 6 times. 7. That is worse. Annie Smille. The back door opened softly. Charles entered. No tie. Sweater instead of suit. He carried 2 folders. Lena looked over. You ate? Yes. Truth? Half. Still bad. He almost laughed. Charles sat across from Annie. She closed the laptop. He placed the folders on the table. One before Lena. One before Annie. Lena frowned. What is this? Charles looked at Annie first. Open yours. She did. University documents. Financial forms. Trust papers. Her hands stopped. At the top, adoption petition. Annie Bell Whitmore. The kitchen disappeared. Lena slowly lowered her spoon. Mr. Whitmore. Charles folded his hands. I made a promise. Nobody moved. Annie looked up. You were serious? Yes. Silence. Lena sat down slowly. My daughter already has a mother. Charles nodded immediately. I know. No, sir. Her voice softened. Do you really? Charles looked at Annie, then at Lena. When my wife died, people brought flowers. He smiled faintly. Then they brought lawyers. Silence. Everyone asked about money. The company. The estate. He looked down. Nobody asked if Brandon still slept with the hallway light on. Lena listened quietly. I failed him. Charles's voice lowered. And I won't pretend otherwise. Nobody interrupted. He continued. But Annie. He looked toward her. She walked into fear and stayed. She protected me when she owed me nothing. Annie lowered her eyes. Charles pushed the papers gently toward her. This is not replacing family. He looked at Lena. This is expanding it. Lena's eyes filled. For a moment, nobody spoke. The radio on the counter played soft jazz. Soup simmered. The clock ticked. Ordinary sounds carrying an extraordinary night. Annie finally looked up. Why me? Charles smiled. Because you notice things. The answer broke something inside her. Not sadness. Relief. Lena reached for Annie's hand. You decide, she whispered. Annie looked at the papers again. Howard University. Tuition trust. Legal adoption. Future. Words she had spent years trying to reach alone. She looked at Charles. If I say yes. He waited. You don't get to call Mom less important. Lena laughed through tears. Charles shook his head immediately. Never. And she keeps bossing both of us. Lena looked offended. Keeps? Charles smiled for real this time. Agreed. Annie laughed softly, then nodded. Yes. Silence. Lena covered her mouth. Charles sat back slowly. Not surprised. Grateful. Outside the kitchen windows, the east garden lights glowed across the stone path. The greenhouse stood empty. Peaceful. The same place where fear once waited. Later that night, Lena went upstairs. Charles remained in the kitchen. Annie opened her laptop again. Scholarship essay still unfinished. Charles poured water, then paused. Good night, daughter. The room went still. Annie looked up. He had already turned toward the door. No ceremony. No speech. Just the sentence. Simple. Honest. She smiled. Good night, Dad. Charles stood there 1 second longer, then left. Annie returned to the screen. Outside, the garden lights remained steady. No envelopes. No footsteps. No shadows moving beneath the window. Only quiet. Real quiet. The kind earned after truth. The lamp above the kitchen table still burned. Annie kept studying beneath it. But now the house felt different. Not because it was larger, because she belonged in it. This story reminds us that betrayal does not always come from strangers, and loyalty does not always come from blood. Sometimes the people society overlooks are the ones who see the truth most clearly. Annie had no power, no title, and no wealth. Yet her courage protected a man everyone else had already started giving up on. The story also shows that fear can be used as a weapon, but kindness, honesty, and quiet strength can defeat it. In the end, family was not defined by inheritance or status, but by who stayed when everything began to fall apart. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.